Hello there. If you've been here before or seen my channel, you may remember in an earlier video I started to build this French cleat wall, and I got these two little holders here built, and then I ran out of materials. So in the meantime I have finished the wall as shown here, and what I'm going to do in this video is show how I then filled this wall out after I attached it to the wall and made it all solid and everything with lots of different holders. So we'll kick off with what must be the simplest project you could possibly build, which is a little shelf, and you can see here it's holding this staple gun thing that I've got. Started off by just measuring how big that staple gun was, and then cutting that back bit down to size. I can then do the same for the little shelf bit that's going to hold the staple gun itself, and I've got all the bits ready. So that's pretty simple. Just stick that together, make a basic shelf. I actually came back and then pre-drilled and screwed that together just to give it a bit more strength later on. I then cut the cleat, stuck that on the back, and hey presto, shelf is done. I actually came back after this and added these little front supports so it didn't fall off if the table got knocked or anything. And yeah, project 1 done. Project 2 then, I bought these hand planes at an antique market, so it looks like I have some idea of what I'm doing, even though I don't know how to use them, and I needed some way of sticking them onto the French cleat wall. So I cut down these strips of scrap plywood that I had to form some thin runners, I guess you'd call them. They came out pretty rough, so I had to spend about 16 years sanding them down. But eventually I had lots of battens of uniform thickness that I could use to create a sort of frame on the background. I always think the less measuring and more referencing you can do, the more accurate the build is, for me anyway. So what I do is I try and put the battens on around the planes that I'm trying to fit, and then I can take a measurement that fits between those two reference points, which I transfer to the crosscut sled, and cut a batten to that length using a little stop block that you can see here. Once I've managed to cut all those down, I can just use the plane itself as the reference for where that strip needs to be as a divider between the different planes. And you can see that's what I'm doing here. Put it in place and then pin it. And I can just repeat that for each and every plane that I want to hold here. With that done, I can drive a few more pins in just to make sure it's solid, and then set my fence to the same width as the outside battens. And that's really the size of the backing board done. And all that's left to do is to do what I'm doing here, which is to add some little strips across the top of each plane that will stop them from falling backwards off of the shelf once it's mounted. With all those strips added, the planes will now not fall off when it's mounted on the wall, so we have to now just put it on the wall. So I'm using this scrap block, which I'm going to cut in half at an angle, and that's going to create two wedge pieces, which when I then mount to the back of this board, will lean the planes back when they are mounted on the French cleat wall. Unfortunately, I had no way to do this safely with the table saw, so I had to hand saw it, which meant doing something physical, which sucked. But I did that, and then I could just use this little spacer block to get them evenly spaced from the top of the stand, and then I can add a French cleat to the back of that, which is the whole thing done and ready to be mounted on the wall. With those in place, there's now something on the wall that makes it look like I have at least some idea that I know what I'm doing, which I don't. And it's time to then do project 3, which is to organize all the different grit sandpapers, files, sanding blocks, and different grit sandpapers I have for the detail sander as well, just so that they are easy to access when I actually come to doing my least favorite thing, which is sanding. Similar to the last project, I'm going to use scrap material to build this, so I started by just breaking this down to thirds roughly, and that will just give me a basis on which to work. So I shouldn't really run it against the fence like I did there, so for the last cut I didn't, and that worked a lot better. And then I sanded those down just to break off the rough edges like I did last time. So those 3 strips I cut will form the 2 sides and the back, and now I need to cut the top and the bottom to be the same depth as those sides. And to do that, I use the spacer strip and then the sides themselves to set the fence. And that spacer strip is there so that when I make the cut, as I just did there, it is not running along the fence like it did in those first few cuts. And you can see I can just repeat that by putting the strip there and running it up against it. Now for the top and bottom, because there's a back, I need to knock off the thickness of the material, which is what I'm doing here. By standing the bit on its side, I'm measuring the thickness, and then again by using that spacer strip and then pushing it up to that spacer strip when I run the cut through, I'm cutting off the perfect width of the material. That's all the sides of the box cut then and fitting, And the next thing to do is just to cut the strips so that it would accept some shelves so that I can separate the different grits of sandpaper. Now I did this by marking out the spacing that I wanted, and then I run it through the table saw in 2 passes so that the thickness of the blade equals the thickness of the material that I'm using for the shelves, which I just tested in that little shot then. I then just run this and repeat it through for every single one of the 2 sides and the back, and every single slot that I needed. And there's a lot of cuts made, so I'm not going to show them all, but as you can see, I adjust the little stop fence that I have each time and just make a couple of passes so that it takes off the correct width of material that I want. Once all those cuts are made, I can get the pieces together and start the assembly process. And you can see here when I fold it up, all those grooves line up nicely to accept the shelves. With the box made, I now need to measure how big I need to cut the shelves to be. So I took this metal ruler, stuck it inside the slots themselves, and then I wrote down those measurements on my notepad, which is also my workbench. And then I could just get that thin material and cut it down on the table saw, having set that to those measurements. To my own surprise, these actually fit really, really well, and I had some shelves that are removable as I need them, and I can start organizing all the sandpaper into them, and that's the project really done. Only thing left to do is to put the shelf on and then get it up on the wall. As you saw in the first clip, I then came back, I put some screws in each side just so I could hang some files, and on the other side the sandpaper, and then on the top I figured I would just plonk the sanding block thing that I had just as somewhere to store it. Right, we're getting through them now. This is project number 4, the pocket hole mount jig. I don't know what to call it, but yeah, it's somewhere that I mounted the pocket hole jig I bought from Amazon, and I could just quickly take this whole plate down, put it on the table, and then use it to make my pocket hole cuts with all the accessories I need to adjust the different stops and everything that comes with the jig. So start off by just centering that jig onto the MDF board that I'm using to mount it, drilling that in place, and then I can lay out where I want all the tools to be and just draw in pencil around them where I want them to finally end up. Now I bought these little magnets that are 8mm thick, so I used an 8mm bit to cut a hole, which it turned out the magnets just fit perfectly. I was going to glue them in, but I didn't need to in the end, they just fit with pressure. So I I drilled that hole and then pushed those in, and as you can see here, it worked perfectly well to hold the lighter objects. This is really all I did for everything that needed to be mounted on this, apart from these 2 drill bits that had the collar on for the depth stop. The collar just meant that they wouldn't sit flat, so all I did is I took a spade bit and just hogged out some of that material so that the drill bit itself would sit flush against the backing board. And then again, same thing, drilled the 8mm wide hole, put those magnets in, and then those drill bits set perfectly as well. That's the bulk of the things mounted that I will actually use to use this jig, and you can see here how it's going to work. I can just hook it onto the edge of the workbench, clamp whatever wood I need, and then drill the pocket hole. There's a couple more things to add, so this card stops you damaging the plate when you're setting the depth, and I just put this on with a picture hook that you can see here. With that on, there was one more thing to add, which is this shelf for the accessory that I don't actually know what this is for, but it came with the set, so I'm going to mount it. And I put that shelf on with a couple of screws, and then there you go. You can see it mounted on the wall. This is just a demonstration of how it works. With the French cleat added to the back, it hooks on to the edge of the workbench, and I can just use it to clamp in bits of wood and then drill some pocket holes in them. Right, project number... oh, there you go, it's 5. I'm losing count now. I think there's 8. There's 8 here. Stick around. There's some good ones at the end. Anyway, this one's for all the measuring devices that I use regularly. So again, scrap bit of MDF that I'm using as the backing board. Just lay them out where I want them to be and mark where that is. I cut it down I didn't film that for some reason, but I did cut it down. I then used the same thing, drew out in pencil where I want them to be. I actually used the punch I'm mounting here itself to then just give me a marker where I wanted to drill, and then I pre-drilled out all the holes that I needed. Now I used the same magnet trick here to mount some of the measuring tools, but it turns out these tools are brass or something that is not magnetic, so they don't actually work with the magnet. So that is some little thinkies, as you can see there, and decided in the end to do something else. So I mounted the shelf that the tape measure is going to go onto while I thought about this. Super simple. And then I came back and decided what I needed to do was to get a scrap block of wood and just drill a big hole in it, basically, so that this can sit in with gravity holding it in place. I didn't drill a big enough hole to start with, so got a bigger bit, drilled a bigger hole, and then I basically just stuck this on to the board with a couple of screws, and that's how I'm going to mount the punch. So with that mounted, the punch will just sit in there, that's sorted, and the other two little devices I was going to mount here have bits of metal that were magnetic, so they just hooked on there, and that worked out quite nicely. I then cut a couple of strips of wood down, pre-drilled some holes, and then countersunk that from the other side, and that's so I can attach these just with some screws to act as a little shelf that's going to hold on the measuring scribing tool that I'll probably never use. That's project 5 done then. All the measuring tools that I might use one day when I actually know what I'm doing are ready and accessible to hand. And we're really getting to the home straight now. Project number 6, there you go. Regular use items. These are things that I should have mounted first because they're things I use all the time. So some countersink holes, screwdrivers, scissors, pliers, you name it. I started off by ripping down an old bed slat. I'd ripped the curved edge off of that so that it can be mounted to this MDF shelf as a little shelf. And I just pre-drilled and then screwed that into place to hold it. Now with the shelf mounted, I could just take a spade bit and drill some holes in it so that all the tools I want to mount can just slot in there nicely. And this worked well for lots of them, but not this spanner adjustable wrench thing. It was just too wide for the spade bit. So I marked that against the shelf, the width it needed to be, and then I used the spade bit to cut a hole in the middle of those marks, and then I cut at an angle, which will remove material that eventually gets thinner down to where that spade bit cut is. And that means that as I push that spanner wrench thing in, it gets tighter and you can see it holds it pretty firmly. I had some space left at the end here, so I added a few more holes for pens, and then I ripped it down to a final height so it would fit on in the gap that I had in the wall, put a French cleat on the back, and then put it into place. And from where I loaded it here, I still had some space left, so I actually came back in the end and drilled some more holes where I put my countersink bits that you can see on the left there, and managed to get some of the drill bits in as well behind. Well done if you're still here. I don't know how. I'm bored, and this is my life. This is what I did. Anyway, I had lots of hammers, and I needed some way to mount them because I use them all the time because I often have to hit things hard out of frustration, or because I need to take them apart again where I've built them incorrectly, which is often. Subscribe. And now, so what I did is I just marked out where each hammer goes, and then I cut these strips down that I'm eventually going to hang in the same way I did the scribe in the earlier project. I'm going to cut these strips and just screw them on the backboard, and they're going to act as little hooks that the hammers can be held on. So for each one, I put those into place, measured the height against the hammer, and then cut it on the line that I marked. And eventually that gave me lots of strips that I could just come in, pre-drill, and mount in the exact same way you saw earlier. And I'm not going to show all of it because there's a lot of holes drilled and a lot of things mounted, but you should get the gist. Pre-drill, countersink, drive the screw into the back, and all of these little shelf things will be put in place. It's time. We're there. It's the final project. I needed somewhere to put all of the glue and rolling bits and various adhesives and the ways I use to attach things on the wall, just the regular use items. So I started again, scrap bit of MDF that I'm going to use as the backboard, and ripped down a bit that I'm going to use as a shelf. I then cut that shelf down to the same width as the backboard, using the backboard as the measuring thing, again school of no measurement, and pre-drilled and put some screws in to hold that shelf in place. Now from the plane project earlier, I had lots of these strips of plywood left over, so I used these to create a little lip around the edge of the shelf so that things wouldn't fall off. To mount the epoxy bottle and the rollers, I chose to use nails. Now the heads were a little too thick to fit around the holes that I was hanging these various things from, so I took a file to them, filed them down, and then just drove those in with a hammer, and as you can see, that held the epoxy bottle and it can slide on and off really easily. I stuck the edge lip on by just cutting that to size, and then I could put the various things I want to have on this shelf into place just to see where things need to be and where nails need to go. As I said, I'm going to use a nail with a file down top to mount these rollers as well, so I filed that down to size, drove that in, and then that would hold the rollers just fine. That's it done, really. So all I had to do was put it into place and see where it needed to go, and that's where I'm going to put the cleat on the back. So I drew that line where I needed it to be, and then I took the cleat that I had cut and I lined up the bottom of that with the line that I drew. And that just lets it sit in the right height. Attached that in the same way, pre-drilled, countersunk, drove the screw in, and that's the shelf done. I could put it on. I had to take the hammers off because it didn't fit. But once it was mounted, it fit perfectly in place, and then I could just go about mounting everything that needed to be mounted. Well done if you're still here. You're probably not. I've accepted I'm probably alone at this point, but regardless. Here's a shot of the wall as a whole now. With all the projects done, it's been super useful to have, and you're going to see it in the background of a lot of the future videos. I've got some good ones coming up where I build a router table. I finish off the storage that I built on the back wall, and yeah, loads of other projects going on. So subscribe if you want, and thank you.